Carlos Condit landed 151 significant strikes against Nick Diaz. Now think about that for a second. Some guys go their whole careers and don't land that many strikes combined. Some guys win fights throwing 20, 30, maybe 50 strikes. Condit, he threw nearly 320 and landed 151. That is the kind of fighter he was. Relentless, violent, a storm that just kept coming at you. That's why they called him the natural-born killer. By 2021, the man who once drowned opponents in violence could barely throw a punch without pain tearing through him. After 46 brutal fights, the natural-born killer walked away. But to understand how Carlos Condit lost his edge, we have to go back, way back, to where it all began. And that's Albuquerque, New Mexico. This isn't the kind of place where you can afford to be soft. It is a city that forges fighters. There is a reason that some of the toughest guys in MMA history have come from Albuquerque. We're talking Holly Holm, Diego Sanchez, Rashad Evans, and the GOAT, Jon Jones. It's not a fancy place. There are no big Hollywood dreams here, no bright lights, just dust, grit, and a whole lot of fighting. Carlos Condit was born into that world. He wasn't some silver spoon athlete. He didn't come from a long line of combat sports champions. He was just a scrappy kid from New Mexico. Carlos was raised by his father, Brian Condit, who was a politically active man in New Mexico. He worked as the chief of staff for Governor Bruce King. But while his dad was handling politics, Carlos was learning how to fight. Like a lot of kids, he was drawn to martial arts early on. But unlike most kids, he didn't just train for fun. He wanted to fight for real. And soon he found the perfect place to do it. Now, if you're a hardcore MMA fan, you already know the name Greg Jackson. If you don't, let me put it this way. This guy has created some of the greatest fighters in MMA history. Jon Jones, Rashad Evans, Holly Holm, Donald Cerrone, and of course, Carlos Condit. When Condit first walked into Jackson's MMA, he was just a skinny kid with a mean streak. But Greg Jackson saw something in him, something special. Jackson was not your average coach. He wasn't the kind of guy who just taught you how to throw a jab or shoot for a takedown. He was a strategist, a guy who studied fighting like it was a science experiment. And he saw in Condit the perfect canvas for his kind of art. Carlos wasn't a technical wizard. He didn't have a polished wrestling background or a high-level BJJ game. What he had was pure aggression. And Jackson took that aggression and shaped it into one of the most dangerous styles that the sport had ever seen. Carlos was special from day one, Greg Jackson would later say. He had this raw aggression, but more importantly, he had that thing you can't teach. The ability to dig deep when most fighters would quit. He wasn't just tough, he was smart tough. That's rare. A style built on violence, volume, and relentless pressure. A style that would eventually turn him into a world champion. Most kids at 18 are just figuring life out. Some are going to college. Some are working their first job. Some are still playing video games in their parents' basements. But Carlos Condit was throwing fists for a living at that age. He took his first professional MMA fight at the age of 18. And from the moment the cage door locked behind him, something clicked. He realized that this was what he was meant to do. His first few fights were pure chaos. He didn't fight safe. He didn't pace himself. He just went in there and tried to tear his opponent's head off. And more often than not, he succeeded. By the time he turned 20, Carlos had already fought over a dozen times, racking up knockouts, submissions, and highlight reel finishes. He started making a name for himself, and soon the world started to take notice. At first, Condit was all aggression, no strategy. He was wild. He threw everything at his opponents with reckless abandon. But as he trained more with Greg Jackson, he started to refine his violence. Instead of just throwing bombs non-stop, he learned how to pick his shots. Instead of just walking forward, he learned angles, footwork, and timing. But what made Condit truly special wasn't just his offense, it was his mentality. The guy never backed down. He had zero quit in him. You could drop him, hurt him, bloody him, but it didn't matter. He would keep coming. That is what made him so dangerous. I mean, just look at this clip of Jackson encouraging Condit to go to war, and you can see how he lights a fire in him.
It's about war. Do you understand me? You bounce, you move, and you punish this kid. This is 5 minutes of war. Now you go and you give it to me.
And And that is why when he got the call to fight in the WEC, he didn't hesitate. He knew this was his shot at something bigger. He knew it was time to show the world who Carlos Condit really was. The World Extreme Cage Fighting promotion was like the UFC's younger, crazier brother. While the UFC had the money, the pay-per-view events, and the prestige, the WEC was all about pure violence. These guys didn't fight for money or legacy. They fought because they loved to throw hands. And in 2007, Carlos Condit walked in like a man built for this kind of madness. At this point, he was already a savage, a finisher with an 18-4 record. But the WEC was the big leagues now, a place that would truly test him. His first fight, a one-sided destruction. He steamrolled Kyle Jensen in under a minute and a half, choking him out cold with a rear naked choke. That earned him a fight with Brock Larson, a powerhouse wrestler with a ridiculous 24-1 record. Larson was supposed to be Condit's toughest challenge, a nightmare matchup on paper. Instead, Condit took him apart and choked him out in the first round. The WEC realized what they had, a killer, so they gave him a title shot. That is when Condit stepped in against John Alessio, a gritty veteran, but Condit couldn't be stopped. He controlled the fight and put Alessio away with yet another rear naked choke. Just like that, he was the WEC welterweight champion. His title defense against Hiromitsu Miura would become an all-time classic, a wild 4-round war that pushed Condit to his limits. Miura refused to go away, landing bombs and even throwing Condit around with some huge slams. But Condit kept marching forward, overwhelming him until he finally got the TKO finish in the 4th round. By the time the UFC absorbed the WEC's welterweight division, Condit had proven himself as one of the most dangerous 170-pounders in the world. Fans were dying to see him in the UFC, and when he finally arrived, they wasted no time throwing him into the deep end. They matched him up against Martin Kampmann, a dangerous, well-rounded fighter who was not going to make things easy. Both guys went to war, both guys had their moments. Condit threw wild combinations, landed knees, and showed off that insane chin that would become legendary. But Kampmann was a step ahead, mixing in takedowns and landing just enough to steal a split decision win. For Condit, this was a wake-up call. This wasn't the WEC anymore. There were no easy fights. Every single guy in the UFC's welterweight division was a stone-cold killer. If he wanted to make a run for the belt, he had to get even better. So that is exactly what he did. That's when he started becoming the natural-born killer. You see, the thing about Carlos Condit is that he wasn't just a violent finisher. He was stylish about it. He wasn't some stiff brawler who just swung haymakers. He was fluid, creative, and fearless. His strikes weren't basic. They were spinning elbows, flying knees, and crisp combinations that looked like they were straight out of an action movie. He fought like a video game character with no stamina bar. He was a machine gun and a sniper all in one. He walked forward, ate shots, and gave back twice as much, all with the intent of finishing his opponent. And the UFC quickly realized that Condit was a must-watch fighter, much like how fighters like Dustin Poirier and Justin Gaethje are. So they gave him the perfect stage to prove it. A fight against Jake Ellenberger. And what a fight it was! Ellenberger came out like a wrecking ball, dropping Condit twice in the first round. Most guys would have been finished right then and there, but not Condit. He weathered the storm, dug deep, and started taking over. By the end of the fight, Ellenberger was exhausted, and Condit was still pushing forward, landing shots and proving that he was made as something special. He won by split decision, but more importantly, he proved that he could survive hellfire and keep coming. And after that fight, Condit went on a rampage. The UFC gave Condit Rory MacDonald, an undefeated Canadian prospect who was GSP's training partner and the future of the division. For 2 rounds, Rory was beating Condit up. He was younger, faster, and sharper, but in the 3rd round, Condit would flip the switch. He battered Rory, pouring on the pressure until the ref was forced to stop the fight. Back-to-back wins from the brink of defeat. Then came Dan Hardy. Condit shut him down, one of the most brutal knockouts of his career, landing a perfect left hook counter that put Hardy to sleep. After that, there was Dong Young Kim, an undefeated grappler. People thought Condit would struggle with his wrestling. Instead, Condit flying kneed him into another dimension. 3 fights, 3 insane finishes. Now there was no denying it. Carlos Condit was officially 1 win away from fighting for the title. And his next opponent was the perfect test, Nick Diaz. Now, if you were an MMA fan back then, you already know how massive this fight was. Nick Diaz was a full-blown cult hero. He had been wrecking guys in Strikeforce, flipping people off mid-fight, and talking so much trash that it made his fights feel personal. And after he obliterated BJ Penn, people were convinced he was the real champ, not GSP. So when Condit and Diaz got booked for the UFC Interim welterweight championship, it felt like we were about to witness the ultimate fight between two savages. Diaz had his pressure, volume, and endless cardio. Condit had his dynamic striking, movement, and killer instinct. It was supposed to be a bloodbath. From the opening round, Condit did something that caught everyone off guard. Instead of standing and banging like Diaz wanted, Condit stayed mobile, moved laterally, and picked his shots. Diaz kept pushing forward, talking trash, flipping him off, but Condit stuck to the plan. Every time Diaz tried to trap him against the cage, Condit sidestepped, landed a few shots, and reset. And while a lot of fans hated it, it was actually a brilliant strategy. Because if you fight Diaz's fight, you're done. Just ask Robbie Lawler, ask Paul Daly. But the fans, they were pissed. They expected a war, and instead they got a tactical fight where Condit refused to engage in Diaz's usual chaos. When the final horn sounded, Diaz raised his hands like he had already won. Then came the judge's decision. Carlos Condit wins by unanimous decision. And just like that, MMA Twitter exploded into a full-scale meltdown. Nick Diaz, being Nick Diaz, immediately grabbed a mic and said, "I'm done with this. I don't need this shit." He stormed out of the cage, later claiming that he was retiring, and even hinted that Condit ran from him the whole fight.
I don't need this, you know what I mean? I pushed this guy backwards the whole time. He ran from me the whole fight.
I threw a spinning back fist or something. He told me, so we're throwing spinning now? And I felt like I dominated almost every round. He did take my back there at the end and, maybe won that round. But I think for the most part, I picked him apart.
I don't know, man. That's crazy. That's crazy.
To this day, fans still argue about it. Some say Condit fought smart and deserved to win. Others say he played it too safe and robbed Diaz. But no matter what you think, the win meant one thing. Carlos Condit was now the UFC Interim welterweight champion. And his next fight would be against the greatest welterweight of all time. At this point, GSP was the most dominant champion in MMA history. The guy had cleaned out the division, winning 9 straight fights, dominating everyone with his ridiculous wrestling and fight IQ. And after spending more than a year recovering from an ACL tear, he was back to defend his title against Condit. The buildup was huge. People saw Condit as the biggest threat to GSP in years. He had elite striking, knockout power, and a submission game that could catch anyone slipping. If anyone could end the reign of GSP, it was him. But as soon as the fight started, reality kicked in. From the opening seconds, GSP made one thing clear. I am taking you down, and there is nothing you can do about it. And that is exactly what he did. GSP landed 7 takedowns in the fight, controlled Condit for around 15 minutes on the ground, even though Condit managed to outstrike GSP 190 to 172 in total strikes. Every time Condit tried to set up his striking, GSP would shoot in, take him down, and control him from top position. For the first 2 rounds, it was classic GSP dominance. But then, Condit gave us one of the greatest moments of his career. Early in the 3rd round, GSP was doing his thing, pressuring Condit, working his jab, looking for another takedown. Then out of nowhere, boom! Condit uncorked a head kick from hell, blasting GSP across the head and sending him crashing to the canvas. For a brief moment, time stopped. GSP was hurt. Bad. Condit swarmed him, hammering away with punches, seconds away from pulling off one of the greatest upsets in UFC history. The crowd was losing their minds. Joe Rogan was screaming, "George is hurt! George is hurt!"
Condit. That's a nice kick! Oh, he got George is hurt!
Condit with a big kick to the head! Condit swarming St. Pierre!
But then, somehow, GSP survived. He scrambled, recovered, and by the end of the round, he had taken Condit down again.
I got kicked in the head. That's a nice kick. Oh, he damages her. Tommy with a big kick to the head.
He damaged my temple artery, by the way. It was a hard kick, man.
George is in big trouble.
So I'm in my butt and I see Carlos Condit coming to me and I'm like, I've seen this before.
That's the hardest, George St. Pierre.
Instead of telling, oh, I need to give it back to him, I fall on the ground. I said, you know what? Yes, I got caught.
I lean back, I use the guard, the shield to parry the punches.
It's time to defense. Catch up your breath, catch up your senses.
And I'm able to survive it.
We are headed to the champ.
From there, it was more of the same. For the next 2 rounds, GSP stuck to his game plan, drowning Condit with pressure, wrestling, and control. By the end of the fight, there was no doubt. GSP wins by unanimous decision. Losing to GSP wasn't a career ender, because honestly, everyone lost to GSP. But this fight showed something important. Carlos Condit was the real deal. Even in a fight where he spent most of the time stuck on his back, he still gave fans a moment to remember forever. He still had the heart, the resilience, and the ability to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. If you thought Condit had already been through hell in his fights with Nick Diaz and GSP, you haven't seen anything yet. Because after that title fight loss, Carlos Condit did not take an easy road back. He never did. He could have taken some tune-up fights, could have fought a lower-ranked guy to rebuild his momentum. But nah, Carlos Condit wasn't built like that. Instead, he walked straight into the most brutal wars of his career. Fights that left him physically broken, fights that pushed him to his absolute limit, and fights that slowly, fight by fight, chipped away the killer instinct that made him special. This is where the damage started to accumulate. This is where the natural-born killer started to change. Let's start with one of the most underrated fights of all time, Carlos Condit versus Johny Hendricks. By 2013, the UFC welterweight division was in chaos. GSP was still champion, but people were starting to question how long he could keep this up. He was winning fights, sure, but his fights were starting to feel more tactical and less dominant. Meanwhile, Johny Hendricks was running through people like a human wrecking ball. This dude was built like a fire hydrant with a shotgun for a left hand. He knocked out John Fitch in 12 seconds. He put Martin Kampmann to sleep in under a minute. And people were saying, this is the guy. This is the guy who's going to take GSP out. But before he could fight for the belt, the UFC booked him against Carlos Condit. Think about how insane this matchup was. Hendricks was a power-punching wrestler, and Condit was a high-volume, dynamic striker with a granite chin. Nobody expected this to be a safe fight. And sure enough, it was an absolute war. From the start, Hendricks came out like a maniac, throwing bombs and looking to take Condit's head off. And to his credit, he landed a lot. Hendricks' left hand was a nuclear bomb, and every time he threw it, you could see the power in his shot. But Condit, man, he would not go down. Hendricks cracked him clean over and over, and Condit just smiled, reset, and started firing back. The difference, though? Hendricks had wrestling in his back pocket. So every time Condit started getting momentum, Hendricks would shoot in and take him down. For 2 rounds, that was the story. But Condit wasn't going down that easy. After the GSP fight, he knew he couldn't just rely on his striking. He had to be unpredictable. He had to create chaos. And in the 3rd round, we saw exactly that. Condit went full psychopath mode. Knowing he was probably down on the scorecards, he came out like a man possessed. He started throwing spinning attacks, launching knees, pushing a ridiculous pace, just throwing everything he had left at Hendricks. The crowd was losing it, and for a second you started to wonder, is Condit actually about to pull this off? But once again, Hendricks leaned on his wrestling. In the final seconds, he secured another takedown, controlled Condit just enough, and when the judges' scorecards came in, Johny Hendricks wins by unanimous decision. This was one of the most grueling fights of Condit's career, but the worst part, he took a ridiculous amount of damage. Hendricks landed 12 takedowns. He landed strikes that would put most guys in a coma. And even though Condit fought like a warrior, it was another hard loss. The fight against GSP had already taken its toll. And now, after a war with Hendricks, the cracks were starting to show. He wasn't losing because he wasn't good enough. He was just fighting absolute killers, and every fight was taking something out of him. And things only get worse from here. Because now we have to talk about one of the most violent fights in UFC history. If you're a real MMA fan, you already know where this is going. UFC 195, Carlos Condit versus Robbie Lawler for the UFC welterweight championship. Just saying that out loud is enough to give fans PTSD, because this wasn't just a title fight. This was an all-out war that left both men permanently changed. Let's set the stage. By 2016, Robbie Lawler had fully transformed into the most violent champion the UFC had ever seen. His fights with Rory McDonald and Johny Hendricks had already become legendary. And if you know anything about Robbie Lawler fights, you know one thing: you don't come out of them the same person. Condit wasn't afraid though. In fact, he was ready for war. And when the fight started, it was clear. This was about to be one of the greatest fights of all time. Round 1, Condit comes out aggressive, using movement, volume, and range to keep Lawler guessing. He drops Lawler early, but Robbie just smiles and keeps coming forward like a horror movie villain. Round 2, Lawler starts landing bombs. Every punch he throws looks like it's trying to knock Condit into another dimension. Round 3, this is where Condit starts to take over. He's peppering Lawler with shots from every angle, pushing an insane pace, throwing elbows, knees, spinning attacks, just overwhelming him with volume. Round 4, both guys are exhausted. Both guys are covered in blood, but somehow neither of them stop swinging. Round 5 was the round that broke MMA fans. This round was pure insanity. Both guys empty the tank. Every punch looks like it could knock the other out. Condit is landing volume, but Lawler is landing absolute bombs. Condit landed 177 significant strikes to Lawler's 93, with both men nearly finishing each other multiple times. And when the final horn sounds, they both collapse against the cage, completely spent. Then the scorecards come in. Robbie Lawler wins by split decision. And just like that, Carlos Condit lost what might have been his last real shot at the title. This fight broke him. Not physically, because he fought again, but mentally. After this, Condit started questioning everything. In post-fight interviews, he admitted, "I don't know if I want to do this anymore."
Back, you mentioned that maybe this might be it for you, that this could be the last time you fight in that decision. I mean, is this something you contemplated at all coming into the fight? And do you feel like this is something you feel strongly about, or are you still processing all those emotions at this moment?
It's not really an emotional thing, you know. I'm not dejected. I don't know. I have to evaluate, but yeah, there's a possibility that might be my last one.
And honestly, who could blame him? He just went through one of the most grueling wars in UFC history, gave everything he had, and still lost. And from this point on, Carlos Condit was never the same again.
And I had it 3-2. Condit. So, but I'm not a judge. So nobody probably gives a what I think, but that's how I had it.
Condit had already been through absolute hell at this point. He fought Johny Hendricks in a 3-round war. He went to the gates of Valhalla with Robbie Lawler in a 5-round bloodbath. He came within inches of being the undisputed UFC welterweight champion. But after all of that, something changed. The natural-born killer, the man who never stopped moving forward, never stopped throwing volume, never stopped chasing the finish, was suddenly slowing down. And for the first time in his career, Carlos Condit started losing. A lot. From 2016 to 2021, Condit went 2-6 in his last 8 fights. That was the beginning of the downfall. If there was one fight that truly signaled the beginning of the end, it was his fight with Tyron Woodley at UFC 171. Now let's be real, this was a terrible stylistic matchup for Condit. Woodley was explosively athletic, insanely powerful, and had elite wrestling. And early on, you could see the problem. Woodley was faster, stronger, and every time he landed a punch, you could see the impact. But even with all that, Condit was still in it. He was surviving, staying composed, looking for openings, and then in the second round, bam, Woodley lands a takedown. Condit falls awkwardly, and immediately something is wrong. When Condit tries to stand up, his right leg just completely gives out. Torn ACL. Fight over. And with that, Carlos Condit was out for over a year. Now look, if you've ever watched Condit fight, you know why this injury was so devastating. His entire style depended on movement. He used footwork to create angles. He threw insane spinning attacks and flying knees. He was constantly bouncing in and out of range. So when he tore his ACL, that was a career-altering injury. The movement that made him special was gone, and after he finally recovered, he was never quite the same. Condit returned on the 31st of May in 2015 after a long 14-month layoff and actually looked great against Thiago Alves. He would get a TKO win after a doctor stoppage at the end of the second round. But after that, it was like watching a legend fade in real time. He lost to Robbie Lawler in that heartbreaking split decision. Then came Demian Maia, who dominated him with grappling and choked him out in the first round. Then came Neil Magny, who outpointed him with pure volume and cardio. Then came Alex Oliveira, who submitted him with a guillotine choke. And finally, Michael Chiesa, who completely out-wrestled him and submitted him in the second round. 5 straight losses. 5 fights where you could see it. The killer instinct was gone. So what went wrong? Well, there were a lot of factors. Physically, he wasn't the same. The ACL injury stole his mobility, his explosiveness, and his ability to bounce in and out of range. Also, the damage was adding up. This was a guy who had been in absolute wars for over a decade. His body was breaking down. Mentally, the fire was fading. Even Condit admitted it in interviews. He just wasn't sure if he had it in him anymore. And listen, if you're in the UFC fighting at the highest level, you need to be 100% locked in. The moment you start doubting yourself, questioning if you should still be here, that is when you get hurt. And in 2021, after losing to Max Griffin, Carlos Condit finally did the thing that we all knew was coming. He retired.
If I could compete still, I would. I'm just trying not to get punched in the head anymore. Basically. So I still roll. I don't spar much. I still do some striking, teach striking, but mainly I've sticking with grappling is a little safer.
How long were you pro? How long was your pro career?
About 19 years.
Oh yeah, that's a lot of years to get punched in the head.
Yeah. Especially, sparring back in the day was like no boundaries, no nothing, right? It's just like whatever. We get to fight every day. I get to show up at work and fucking fight people all the time. I'm going to do it. And if your coach doesn't tell you, fucking stop.
And honestly, it was the right call. By this point, he had already fought and beaten some of the best fighters in the world. He had already won a UFC title, interim, but still. He had already given fans some of the most legendary fights in welterweight history. And most importantly, his body just couldn't take it anymore. In interviews, he admitted that every time he threw a punch, he felt pain. Every time he tried to train, his body just didn't respond the way that it used to. And when that starts happening, it's time to go. Condit didn't just retire, he left a void, because fighters like him, they don't come around often. Even the bad guy himself, Chael Sonnen, admitted that he missed seeing Condit in the octagon.
I've been a little pissed off at Carlos Condit for about a year now, as a fan. So he's a straight-up hammer. No way around it.
Sure.
That guy is so freaking talented. And to rewind the tape in my mind about a year, and that's when he took himself out of the sport. He goes, you know what? I'm not going to do this anymore. I go, what are you talking about? You're incredible. There's some positions with some guys. Demian Maia comes. You don't want to be in, but you're amazing. Please don't go. Please don't go. Let me plead to you. And he did, and then it kind of got shut down. I had his manager, Malky, on this show, if you'll remember, and Malky goes, Chael, you're all wrong. It's not a confidence issue. He has not lost his confidence or think he's lost a step. He is worried about CTE, and he did take a concussion or two, and so he wants to put the brakes on. Well, as soon as you bring that up, I'm done.
And once they're gone, you realize just how special they really were.
Just an absolute legend. If there was an independent MMA Hall of Fame, he would be first ballot and then some. And so it was filled with a lot of emotion when I found out that Carlos Condit was going to call it a career. One of my mom's favorite fighters. And so I wanted to have him on the show.
Carlos is a very interesting guy. He doesn't score. He have only one takedown in UFC. But if you look, the time that he has fought on the ground, more than 50% of the time he's on the ground, he's on top position. Because he bait, that's what I've seen in studying his fight. A lot of time he was baiting for submission. So my game tonight, didn't want to end up going for a submission and end up on the bottom with him. Because strangely, he doesn't do takedown, but he's on top for a lot of time, which is very strange for a fighter. He's a very special style.
For years, he was one of those rare fighters who could pull you out of your seat at any moment. You knew that whether he won or lost, he was going to give you a show. He wasn't just fighting to win. He was fighting to entertain, to finish, to create chaos. And his influence, it's everywhere. Look at Max Holloway's volume striking. Look at Justin Gaethje's willingness to go to war. Look at the new generation of fighters who prioritize action over point fighting. Carlos Condit didn't need to be an undisputed champion to leave his mark. His legacy went beyond belts. It was about the way that he fought, the people he inspired, and the wars that he gave us.